You are listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast with Maggie Green, episode number 336.
Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast, a podcast that celebrates cookbook readers, buyers, collectors, writers, and clubs. And now your host, cookbook author, culinary dietitian, and cookbook writing coach, Maggie Green.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. How's everybody doing today? Just returned from a cold weather walk, enjoying my afternoon. Had our first class for cookbooks on KDP today, and I'm so excited to get down to business with the wonderful, lovely people who are inside this cohort of cookbooks on KDP. And I was thinking about something before I had the class with them, and now even more after I had the class, and that relates to recipes. And two questions that I get a lot about recipe writing. One is, how do I make the recipe unique? And two, how do I give credit to sources of inspiration for my recipes? So I think this is important to think about and to talk about, because one of the things that's happening that's having a huge impact on the publishing industry and on the writing industry is artificial intelligence and access to AI, ChatGPT, that actually could write for us, but we don't really know exactly how the AI is being trained, if they're using sources of information to train the AI that they have permission to use, or if things are being used to train the AI that the author did not give permission to. So I think the first thing to remember about recipes is that a mere list of ingredients is not copyright protected. And this is the reason, the two examples I use is that Coca-Cola and Kentucky Fried Chicken, or KFC as it's now known, have not ever released the ingredient list for what they use for their syrup base or their spice mix, because a list of ingredients cannot be protected by copyright. Meaning, someone could take that syrup and make their own soda, or take that spice list and make their own chicken, and that's fine. You can do that. If someone took a brownie recipe from one of my cookbooks and started a business making the brownies out of my cookbook, there is not anything to prevent people from doing that. Because the question is where do these lists of ingredients come from? Who do they belong to? Who owns a pancake recipe? Who owns a omelet recipe? Who owns these basic formulas for the way that things are put together? So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that what is copyright protected is, as a writer, my expression of a list of ingredients with a title and a head note, and the way that I style my ingredients, and the way that the voice I use in my instructions, that all is copyright protected. And in particular, when it's in a book. You can apply for copyright. You have copyright protection in the book. And I don't mean that you have to apply for it. You can register your copyright. You don't have to. But in order to ever say that someone infringed on your copyright, it does need to be recorded as a book with a copyright. When I published my first 4 cookbooks, my traditional publishers took that responsibility to register the copyright for me. And if you self-publish your own book, you'll need to, or you can register the copyright yourself. But just the mere fact that it's in a book and it's in a set of recipes that you're expressing, it is really copyright protected from that point. So this begs two questions then is, okay, well, how do I uniquely express things? And how do I give sources of inspiration? Because we know that we're always inspired all the time as recipe writers and as cooks by the things that we see around us. So let me start with the first question, the source of inspiration. I always think that if someone directly inspired you, a recipe that you've used that someone else wrote, or if you went to a restaurant and something inspired you, just say it. And it's not that you're copying their work, but just tell people who and what inspired you. And maybe take a recipe that inspired you and combine it with another recipe that inspired you and make your own recipe written in your own words. Sometimes I call these recipe babies, where you take one recipe and another recipe and you have a recipe baby. I've heard these called idea babies from some people. One recipe, one idea from somebody, another idea, and you think about it and you integrate it and you turn it into an idea that you have. This happens all the time. So if you're really inspired by somebody and they have been a major source of inspiration for you, just say it. There will never be a cookbook author or food writer that argues with you putting the name of their work and their name in your book as inspiring. I promise. If anyone ever wants to be inspired by my recipes, have at it. Now, if they want to publish something word for word that I have written and they want to use it in their work, they need to definitely provide the name of where they got that from, where they got the recipe from, where they got the idea from. You definitely have to say it and just give credit where credit is due. That's why cookbook authors, you often see if they have many books that they turn to for resources, things that they leaned on to learn, they'll often have a resource list of books in their book because they use these books to inspire them. And they use these books for their work. And if they ask for permission to copy a recipe, they get permission and they say exactly where they got that from. So this has happened to me. People want to use my recipes in various books, and my publisher gives permission or I give permission, and they say, this is Maggie's recipe for such and such. It's from such and such book, and I had permission to use it. So if you're inspired, give your source of inspiration. If you're copying a recipe, ask for permission and definitely give credit. And every recipe that you write needs to be in your words, in your own voice, and you can have recipe babies, combine things, mix things up. But that's what the fun about writing recipes is, and getting in your kitchen and trying things, is that you then get to use your lived experience of working with that ingredient or working with that dish and writing things in your own words. And that's the second question I often get is, well, then how do I make my recipes unique? So I want to tell you a story about mashed potatoes, because I think mashed potatoes is one of these recipes or procedures. It's not even really a recipe. How many recipes for mashed potatoes do you think are out there? And how many different ways are people talking about mashed potatoes? But my mom was a mashed potato master. And for many reasons, she made them 5 pounds at a time because they filled up our family of 10. They stayed hot. Potatoes were cheap. They went well with all the foods my dad liked. My dad liked. And how do I know this? Because I asked her. I always liked her mashed potatoes. I wanted to have a mashed potato recipe in Kentucky Fresh, so I asked my mom about it. But in talking to her, here's what else she told me. These were the actual nuggets. It wasn't the fact that it called for 5 pounds of potatoes with water and so much salt and so much butter and so much milk. Just listen to what else she said. She said, always use Idaho or russet potatoes, never red or yellow potatoes. They're too starchy. They're good for other things, but if you're going to make the best mashed potatoes, use Idaho or russets. And then she told me, always use plenty of salt. She said, potatoes are bland, and when mashed potatoes are undersalted, they never taste good, so use plenty of salt. And I think it's funny because when I was in culinary school, we talked about salt as a flavor enhancer and as a seasoning. And when you think about potato chips, the salt on the potato chip is a seasoning. It is part of the flavor profile of the potato chip. And I think it's kind of the same thing for mashed potatoes. Okay, so number 3 is Drain the potatoes well. Boil them in water and then drain them well. And if you want to be thrifty, she said, you could save the potato water and use it for soup. Now, if that isn't like an old-fashioned tip, I don't know what is. But there was this whole trend of saving vegetable water that you cooked vegetables in to make soup with, because it was not just plain water, it was flavored. And potato water has a thickness to it. And some people even use potato water when they make rolls, dinner rolls. So Mom said you could save the potato water. She also said, this is funny, add margarine and hot milk, never cold milk, because cold milk makes the mashed potatoes lumpy. And if it's Thanksgiving, you substitute butter instead of margarine. My mom grew up in a time, and I was raised in a time where sticks of margarine were the preferred fat source in things like this. So we always had butter at Thanksgiving, but every other time of the year we had margarine sticks. So she said, if you want to use butter, just have it on Thanksgiving, because that's the only time we really ever had butter in the house. The fifth thing she said was mix with the handheld mixer. If you want fluffy potatoes, use the mixer. She might have had one of those potato mashers that you push down into the potatoes, but she always thought they were more lumpy. So her favorite way was with the mixer. And she just had a handheld mixer, 2 beaters, and she would mix the potatoes. She also said, get someone else to peel and dice them for you. Now, I can see my mom standing at the kitchen sink, peeling apples, peeling potatoes, peeling peaches. But of course, in her mind, one reason you have a lot of children is they could maybe peel the potatoes for you. So if you want to save yourself some time, get someone else to peel them and dice them for you. And when you do that step, you always want to put the peeled and diced potatoes in a pan of cold water so they don't turn brown before you cook them. All right, so I want you to imagine if you took everything that I just said that my mom told me about potatoes, from her perspective and her experience, the difference it makes in a mashed potato recipe. My mom died a couple of years ago, and I miss her terribly for many, many reasons. But one of the things that I've been thinking about lately that's closest to my heart that I miss the most are the conversations we had about things like this. Because these conversations taught me to slow down and be interested in her and pay attention to what she had to say. And we could connect in these conversations over talking about food and cooking. My mom didn't write her recipes down. I never had this conversation with her about vegetable soup, and I wish I had. But if you want to write recipes that have never been written before and publish them in cookbooks that have never been published before, I want to recommend that you get interested in what someone else thinks. This will make your recipes unique. You're going to hear things said about mashed potatoes that you've never heard before in a way you've never heard before. And I want to tell you that that's what's going to add wisdom to your recipes and to your book and a soul to your book, because it comes from a person who has been in the kitchen with the potatoes. So always give your sources of inspiration. If you use a recipe word for word, get permission. Express things in your own words. Make up recipe babies with inspiration from all over the place. Make your recipes unique through talking to people and listening to what they have to say about a food and the way it's cooked. And I promise your recipes will become your own. And people will love to read them. They'll love to cook with them. They'll enjoy the results of working with them. And you will have written memorable recipes and cookbooks for people out there in the world that you can help heal, have fun, or learn in the kitchen. So that is it for today's episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. This is your host, Maggie Green. And until next time, I hope you have a great day and keep loving your cookbooks.
Thanks for listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast. You can find out more information at www.cookbooklove.co.